Last week, I had a really good conversation with the philosopher John Tillson about Plato's work in dialogue form called Meno, which is about whether virtue can be taught. The conversation John and I had was really wide ranging, so I split it into parts. So, part one, a previous part, was where we talked about what virtue is, because Plato and I guess the people in Plato's imagined dialogue believe that you need to figure out what virtue is in order to know whether it can be taught. In this part two of our conversation, John and I hone in on Socrates and Meno's arguments about whether virtue is something that's taught and learned by instruction, or whether virtue is something that is innate and inborn, or whether it's something completely different. And then part three of our conversation will kind of be the finishing up of the conversation on Meno. So here's part two of our conversation. Hope you enjoy. Let's move on to probably one of the most famous things from the dialogue, which is the example of Plato and the slave. So Plato and the slave do this kind of geometrical exercise together. And Plato's point is to say, well, look, there are some things, that some bits of knowledge even, that are innate. And I'll show you. The slave doesn't know math, but I'll show him that he knows how to do this geometrical equation. So Plato does his normal thing. He talks a lot and he ends every sentence with a question mark. And then the slave says, yes, I agree with that. And then another one, well, then if you agree with that, do you agree with this? And then the slave says, yes, I agree with this. So he kind of, the slave, come to find out, I guess, can do geometry. So what do we think of this example? Because I had a lot of difficulty. I had a lot of difficulty with the example. I don't think it shows what Plato thinks.
Do you know what? I'm not sure that this was supposed to be an example of people knowing something by nature.
Okay.
I'm not sure that it was an example of that. Because the reason is that towards when they go on in the dialogue,
yeah,
Plato becomes interested, Socrates becomes interested in whether or not you can learn virtue, and then he says, and by the way, all learning is recollection, and let's not quibble about names.
I see. Yeah.
So that he seems to be, I mean, if his section in which he convinces in which he elicits some knowledge, apparently elicits knowledge of geometry from the slave boy. What I think that's supposed to show is that learning is just recollection.
Right. Okay.
So perhaps all knowledge is had by nature, or to have knowledge by nature is anything. Maybe perhaps it's something different from learning. If it's something different from learning, then it's also different from recalling from past lives.
Yeah, yeah, I see that point. So it's almost, I guess the example is supposed to convince us that the stuff in the soul, I don't even know if it's knowledge, but there's something in the soul, and then learning is kind of, in some ways, getting to that stuff that's there and consciously almost becoming aware of it. Like, I guess the metaphor that I have in mind with the slave example is Socrates is almost looking at the slave as like modern day example would be a computer that has a hard drive that was installed with a lot of stuff on it. So there's a lot of stuff on this hard drive, and maybe somehow the computer is corrupted to where it can't get to the knowledge in the hard drive. So the computer doesn't technically know the stuff on the hard drive, but the hard drive is there. And in some ways, that Socrates is saying, look, we can get the slave to kind of get in touch with this stuff that's in the soul, and that's what learning is.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that you point out that it's not knowledge, the stuff on the hard drive. I think that's a very great.
And I don't know what it would be.
Well, it's knowledge in waiting.
Right.
So it's in some way some sort of repository of information that you have potential access to, but until you have access to it, you don't have knowledge.
Right.
That seems to be it, which is nice. So it's which is interesting. It says something about knowledge. It's almost you have to be consciously aware of it in this life, or have been consciously aware of it in this life, in order for it to count as knowledge.
Yes.
Which is an interesting thing, because it seems that I know all sorts of things that I haven't been consciously aware of.
Right.
So, for instance, I know that there is no hippo in the library at Warwick right now.
Right.
But I've not, that is not a thought that's ever occurred to me before.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I know from some psychological research on memory and how it works that there's this kind of interesting semi-parallel. I don't know if it's actually exactly a parallel, but the idea is if you remember something and you forget that thing, there are a lot of psychologists who believe that the connection in your brain that forms a memory of that thing never actually goes away. What goes away is the pathway to recalling it consciously. And the way they know that, or the reason they hypothesize that, is because people have the phenomena quite a bit. I know I've had it before, where you forget something for years and you can't recall it for years. And then somehow out of the blue, somewhere, you remember it again. It just kind of comes back into your head, whether it's a childhood memory or the name of an author that you can't think of, and then many hours later or many weeks later it comes to you, or something that happens. So the hypothesis is that the connections are still there. It's just the connections to the conscious recall of the thing are not there. So it's almost like I imagine Socrates saying, it's not even that the slave, let's say, was ever consciously aware of the mathematics that was inside his soul, let's say. He just didn't have the connection to conscious awareness of it. And that is what he is trying to do by eliciting all that knowledge in this dialogue, I guess.
Yeah. Perhaps a good way for us to talk about this would be perhaps if I said a little bit about the theory that Plato defends, and then you can say a little bit about how the arguments presented by Socrates does or doesn't achieve that conclusion, or how, what the argument is and how close it comes to it.
Yeah.
But the theory he sort of starts out by saying, to begin with, is some very important and wonderful and divine people have told me something which I take to be a very important and beautiful truth, paraphrasing. And the truth is that human beings lived in a previous life. Human beings have a soul which is detachable from their current body. That soul antedates their lives, their current life, and people in those previous lives learned all sorts of things, presumably knowledge about geometry, various other things. And he wants to say that all things that appear to be learning are in fact a matter of recollection of things from these previous lives. And then in addition to this, what we are really is this soul, and this soul is the sort of thing that will survive death and carry on into the future. He also adds that this soul has always been around. But I guess that's a statement of the position he's trying to defend, and I wonder if you could say how he goes about getting there.
Oh yeah. I think I have some excerpts from that discussion. They're not enough to give us a sense of kind of what happens. But yes, I guess Socrates and the slave boy kind of get together, and Socrates and the slave boy are kind of, I guess, maybe standing face to face or whatever. And Socrates asks kind of a question of the boy, and then the boy answers. And then Socrates asks another question, the boy answers. So here's the excerpt I have. So Socrates asks a question, the boy says 4. Socrates, and might there not be another square twice as large as this, and having like this the lines equal? Boy, yes. Socrates, and of how many feet will that be? Boy, of 8 feet. Socrates, and now try to tell me the length of the line which forms the side of that double square. This is 2 feet, so what will that be? Boy, clearly Socrates, it will be double. So he kind of goes on, and it gets kind of more complex and more complex until the boy does this geometric equation based on the stuff that the boy answers and Socrates asks. Now, I mean, what I see, particularly as kind of an education specialist in education, is that Socrates is asking a lot of leading questions. And what Socrates is basically doing what we might call scaffolding. Basically asking questions of the boy, and then asking questions that get the boy to put the knowledge that he does have together in a particular way that might never have occurred to him. And then all of a sudden he can do that based on Socrates' questions. And then the idea is, well, look, he did it, and I didn't do any teaching. Socrates makes a big deal out of that. Look, I didn't do any teaching, did I, Meno? And Meno says, no. But see, he could do this equation. And it's like, well, if you look at the role that the boy plays and the role that Socrates plays, no, he couldn't do the equation. Because Socrates would basically have the boy plug in variables, and then Socrates would do all the rearranging with his questions. And then the boy says, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then they come to an answer. So I think in a previous conversation, you had mentioned the helium example. It might be worth using kind of the example you used in a previous discussion of ours to illustrate kind of the role of Socrates and the role of the boy, if you recall that example.
Yeah, I do. So suggesting Socrates, how did the example go? So it was something like, why is this balloon floating in this room, boy? And the boy says, I don't know. It's like, well, let me tell you that in the balloon is helium, okay? And in the room is air, okay? When something is in a environment which is heavier than it, it will raise, it will go up.
Or he would phrase it as a question. Would it not raise?
Than the air. Say again?
He would phrase it as a question.
Oh, okay.
Right? If it were an environment heavier than it, would it not raise?
Okay.
Yes, it would raise.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, Socrates. And then is not the air in this balloon lighter than what's around it? Yes, Socrates. Does not the thing which is lighter than that around it tend to elevate? Yes, Socrates. Why then does the balloon tend to elevate in this air? The slave boy might say, why? Because it's lighter than the atmosphere around it. You see, Meno, the child recollected this from a previous life.
Right.
For I did not tell him.
Right.
That was the reason why the balloon was raising. It seems that that the idea of inference is ruled out by Socrates and Plato. That there's no room for inference, and that any knowledge you have from previous lives.
Right.
That seems a very big bullet to bite.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, so I would say that I mean, it's actually kind of strange to me that neither Meno or Plato recognized that what he was doing was in fact teaching. He's just phrasing it as questions. He's saying, okay, if you know this and you know that, you can put them together in this way, and now you can answer a new question with it. Only he's doing that as a question, and somehow, because it was followed as a question, they make a big deal out of it's not teaching. But the questions were leading. I think what he was doing was teaching, just in a kind of a backhanded way, which is what, I mean, a lot of Plato's dialogues are like that. Plato will say something, Socrates will say something very long, put a question mark, and then his interlocutor will say, "Oh yes, I believe that's so, Plato."
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things are kind of interesting here. One of them is, I mean, Socrates knows that he's putting questions to the boy, and says that by doing this, you can sort of get people to remember by putting questions to them. And indeed, you can do this autodidactically. You can do this just by putting questions to yourself without having someone put the questions to you. So you can come closer to knowledge by being the inquirer and the answerer. And in the case of mathematical knowledge, that kind of model seems that kind of model is most plausible in the case of mathematics. So you get Ramanujan, this brilliant Indian mathematician who, as I understand it, was raised without any kind of formal mathematics education, and certainly without any access to much mathematical theory, and was an autodidact who discovered many great and important and obscure things about mathematics, and took himself to have been inspired by gods to come to these truths. And that sort of model fits well with Plato's idea that there's this knowledge that you haven't been taught and you haven't sort of calculated, but you've gotten through some kind of inspiration. Perhaps this isn't completely plausible, but it's at its most plausible. Where it's at its least plausible is with cases like, whether or not Manchester United are going to beat Liverpool in the next football match, and you only remember whether or not they do after they have. And it seems much more plausible to think that you learned that Manchester United beat Liverpool by observing it happen, and that in no way being anything related to recollection.
Or anything that's specific to the particular life that you're leading, right? I mean, it would rule out everything that is learned, I guess, in the process of living this life, right? So I can learn a new password that I create for a website, and I can learn it, but I don't think you could ever argue that was a product of knowledge of a past life. Why would it be? There weren't websites in a past life, and I never had a password to that website. So
I mean, so what it oh gosh, the way I sort of can begin to understand this is like that time is a single untensed block, so that in reality there is no such thing as now, then, tomorrow, later, earlier, yesterday. These tenses don't exist in reality, and that when in some way you can be not in your life now, you're not currently occupying your body now, you are in some sense privy to the untensed block that is the whole of time, or the totality of time. And then in some peculiar way you can be born, or have always been born, and have some sort of link up with these untensed truths. So it's, in a sense, it's not true that Manchester United will win. It's just true that they have won. And looked at from a certain perspective, they will win, or they might win. Looked at backwards, they have won. Looked at now, they are winning. And there's perhaps some way in which you can know what password you did in fact create, and at the same time as you might be perceiving what password you created, or deciding what password you'll create, you'll at the same time be recollecting, or as good as recollecting, what from a tenseless perspective you always did.